Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today's project, which is a bedside table or a nightstand or whatever you want to call it, I'm going to approach a little bit differently because I have a self-inflicted time constraint on this one. So rather than going into the computer and making a 3D model and getting a bunch of precise angles and measurements and stuff, I'm just kind of going to wing it. And in my mind, I have a design that I'm going for, and I have an overall length, width, and height dimension that I'm going to try to fit. And other than that, we're just going to try to get it figured out as we go along. So I've already dimensioned a bunch of rough lumber. I've got these thick ones that are going to make up the legs, and the rest of the walnut is going to make the showier pieces, the tops and the front of the parts that you can see. And then we're going to use the oak plywood as the sides and the back. Stuff that you can't see as much. It'll make it easier. I won't have to glue up as many panels, that sort of thing. So I think that's about it. Time to get started.
Starting with my lumber surfaced on 3 sides, I ran each piece through the table saw to cut off the last rough edge. I sorted through them to give me the best looking surfaces in an overall width that was a shade wider than I would need for my finished panels. All said and done, I had 2 drawer faces and 2 tops that I could cut to the final dimensions later when I knew what that dimension would be. Moving on to the legs, I knew I wanted these to be 2 inches by 2 inches, so I made one cut at the table saw, then rotated the piece and cut it again to give me a perfect square. I also knew how tall I wanted this thing to be, so I set the flip stop on Rockler's miter gauge fence to cut all the legs to their final length. To figure out the joinery, I stood all the legs up and positioned them so the best looking sides faced me. Then I marked each face so I knew where to put my dados. I spent a little time fine-tuning the position of the joinery on one leg, then set up my router to cut the dados for the side panels. Using a featherboard to keep the workpiece pushed against the fence, I slowly pushed each leg through my router table until it hit the stop block. I'm using a 1/2 inch spiral bit, but my panels are 3/4 of an inch thick, so I bumped the fence over and ran each leg through one more time to get a good, snug fit on my panels. Next I set up my dado blade to match the thickness of the panels I glued together earlier. Then once again using the flip stop on my miter fence, I made 2 perpendicular cuts on each leg. This will be the joint that holds the middle shelf. You'll also notice that it intersects the dados I made at the router table, making it so the side panels will butt up against the underside of the middle shelf. For the top shelf, I set up a stop block in line with the outside edge of the dado blade and made the same 2 perpendicular cuts at the top end of the legs. To keep the finished table from potentially wobbling on an uneven surface, I knew I could only have the 4 legs touching the floor and not any other part of the cabinet. So for the bottom joints, I pushed a leg up against my stop block, then holding it firmly against the miter fence, I moved the stop block, placed a paint stick against the leg, then repositioned the block. This bumped my bottom shoulder up 1/8 of an inch. I'll explain my thought process on the bottom here a little bit later. Off camera, I ripped the side panels to width, but I left them long until now so I could get a real-world measurement. I set the middle shelf in place in the legs, then shoved the side up against it. Then I marked the panel flush with the bottom of the dado. I used that measurement to cut both side panels to their final length. The top and middle shelves needed notches in the corners to fit in the joinery in the legs. I did this using the miter gauge and fence on my table saw. I'm sure the internet safety police among you will have a problem with this procedure, and I'll admit that it looks a little suspect. If this panel had been any bigger, I would have done things differently. But as it is, I was able to set my fence and make 2 cuts that gave me the perfect corner I needed. The bottom line here is if you're not comfortable with it, don't do it. The alternating bevel crosscut blade I used gave me a nice clean cut, but it left a little whisker of waste in the corner that I cleaned up with a chisel. I dry fit all the pieces together so I could check the quality of my joinery, and everything lined up perfectly with no gaps. Looking at these legs now, the joinery appears a little complicated, but because I approached it methodically and made sure to keep each piece well labeled, it was really a simple process to get this far. Rather than fight the clock and try to glue all the pieces together at one time, I broke things up into stages. I put glue in the notches of the middle shelves, then put the legs in place. I stood the legs upright and used a band clamp to push all the corners together. Next, I put glue on all the top shoulders and put the top shelf in place using another band clamp to secure it. I also used long squeeze clamps from the bottom of the legs to push the top down against the shoulders. With the shelves glued in place, I moved on to the back and side panels. I put glue in the dados as well as along the top of the panel, then slid the panels in place. Then, I used clamps to pull the panels tight against the underside of the shelf and pull the legs together. I've already decided that I really like this design, and I'll be making a few more of these tables as a part of a complete bedroom set that I'll be doing in the future. One thing I'll do differently is to add some shallow dados to the bottom of the middle shelf to capture the top edges of the back and side panels. These look and function just fine, but in version 2.0, the dados will help hide that top edge and add a little strength. To finish up the bottom of the cabinet, I cut some end grain strips from the offcuts of the shelf panels and glued them to the bottom of the side panels. These are entirely cosmetic pieces, but it continues the look created by the two shelves up top. I went back and forth with this for a while. I figured I needed something at the bottom to keep the front legs from pulling towards each other or splaying out, but I didn't think it required putting in another entire shelf. Even for the guy who loves unnecessary walnut, that just felt like a waste. The single strip across the front is actually performing that strengthening function, and when coupled with the side strips, it looks like the same design is replicated across all three tiers from top to bottom, but without the material waste. Moving on to the drawers, I started with a thin rip jig and made a bunch of walnut strips. I used bandy clamps to glue these strips across one edge of my drawer material to hide the visible edge of the plywood in the drawers. I cut all the drawer components to length with a miter gauge and flip stop, then used my router table to cut half-lap joints into both ends of the drawer sides. The drawer slides that I'm using require a ½ inch of space underneath the drawer bottom, so I set my fence exactly a ½ inch away from the bit, then cut dados in all my drawer pieces. The drawer slides also require a notch cut out from the bottom in the back of the drawer. This can be done after the drawer is assembled, but I thought it might be easier to do now. Using the flip stop and a magnetic block, I could cut 4 identical notches quickly. I put glue in all the joints and assembled the drawer bodies. You wouldn't necessarily have to glue the bottom in, but since it's plywood and not a hardwood that can expand and contract, it doesn't hurt anything. Also, on a larger drawer, it wouldn't hurt to throw in some brad nails for strength, but since the undermount slides I'm using are all about making this thing look clean, I'm letting the glue do all the work. I glued some spacers to the inside of the cabinet, then used Rockler's undermount drawer slide jig to install the slides. Magnets hold the slides squarely in the jig, then I placed it against the front of the cabinet and used a clamp to hold it there and free up my hands. I used a self-centering drill bit to drill pilot holes, then ran in a screw in the front and back. I pulled the jig out and added one more screw in the middle for good measure. Once I figured out my spacing, I drew a line marking the height of the second slide and clamped the jig in place once again. A few more holes and a few more screws and the second slide was in place. I repeated the process on the second side of the cabinet and I was good to go. You're probably noticing that hole in the back of the cabinet and wondering why I didn't talk about it. Well, who's telling the story? Just hold your horses, I'm getting to it. The drawers themselves get a small piece of hardware attached that require angled pilot holes in a specific location. Rockler makes a jig to make this step much easier. Just shove the jig in the front corners and drill through the guides until you hit the depth stop. Then, line up the holes in the hardware and run in the screws. On the slides, there's a little hook that needs to be embedded in the back of the drawer. Once again, just hold the jig in place and use the left and right side guide holes to drill a hole in the exact location at the correct depth. With the hardware mounted and the holes drilled, the drawer clicks right in and the soft close function is very satisfying to watch. I marked the location for my built-in power strip high in the center of the back panel. When using a jigsaw on this thinly veneered plywood, I like to use tape to try and cut down on the tear out. I checked the fit of the power strip, then drilled mounting holes for later. For the drawer fronts, I marked the horizontal center, then marked a line where I wanted the handle to sit. I used Rockler's drawer pull jig to mark the hole locations by first centering the jig on the vertical line, then lining up the appropriate line for my handle width and using the center punch to mark the holes. I drilled the holes using my drill press, but this whole operation can be done with the drawer fronts in place on the cabinet. I just prefer the controlled nature of working flat like this. Finally, there's not much left to do but slap on some finish. I used General Finish's Armor Seal for its durability and because I like the looks. I used the same finish in my last video about my dining room table, and honestly, it took me longer to do this thing because it's all nooks and crannies, rather than just a couple of giant flat surfaces. I applied one coat with a foam brush, then wiped up the excess with a clean rag to avoid puddles and streaks. A day later, I did a second coat on the two shelves since they'll see the most wear. We're in the home stretch now. I put some thick CA glue on the lower drawer body and sprayed accelerator on the back of the drawer front. I set the board down on an appropriately sized shim and made sure it was centered left and right before pushing the drawer against the front and holding while the glue hardened. I also ran screws in through the handle holes as insurance to make sure I didn't knock it loose while I worked on the second drawer. The operation for the top drawer was pretty much the same, only this time I used the paint stick again to give me a 1/8 inch space, then I reached my hand through the hole in the back to push the drawer forward against the face. I used the pre-drilled holes as guides to drill all the way into the drawer bodies, then installed the drawer pulls. And finally, I installed the power strip and screwed it in place. You can see the small notch I cut into the back panel to make room for the power cord to come back out at ground level. I just stapled that in place to keep it from coming loose.
Well, I gotta be honest, I'm really excited about this thing. Not only does it look nice, but having the power built in is fantastic. Every house I have ever lived in with my wife, there has been one outlet on the wall that our bed sits against, and it's always on her side. So I usually get one extension cord to run behind the bed and plug into one single plug to power one thing. Usually it's a reading lamp. So my phone has to charge on the other side of the room, my alarm clock's on the other side of the room, but now with this built-in power strip, I can charge my phone, I can have a lamp, I can move my clock over here. And then with this lower shelf, I got room for a book and other things that don't have to clutter up the top. So it's really quite handy. Not to mention it looks really nice. But there's one thing I don't like about it. Not that it's a problem, but it's just against what I had in mind when I started. I wanted these drawer faces to be inset into the legs, just like the side and the back panels are. But because I just made it up as I went along and didn't have a plan, I assumed that the overall depth I was making would accommodate that because they're 9-inch slides and a 12.5-inch depth. Well, because of the cool mechanism in the drawer slides, they needed more depth. If I had made this an inch deeper, I could have made that happen and had these drawer faces inset, but because I didn't read the instructions, I ended up having to go this route. Now this looks nice, I'm very happy with it, but in the future when I make a matching bedroom set for this whole room, this will move to a different bedroom where we need it, and I'm going to make this a little deeper so that I can do the design I had in mind. That's enough of the blather. Huge thank you to Rockler for supporting this video. Everybody make sure you're going to Rockler stores and you're visiting the links and you're going to their website because Rockler is a great company. They have lots of great products to make projects like this and all the hardware and all that kind of stuff that you could possibly need. So check the links down in the description. Go to Rockler. And that's about it. Thanks, guys. I'm going to bed.